What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. And this one is some of my final thoughts ahead of the Game Week 11 deadline. So I'm going to go through the latest press conference information, including updates about Son and Palmer in particular, then answer some of your questions, and then take a quick look at my team as well, although it probably won't end up being quick, and why I might buy Strand Larsen instead of Cunha. So if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like, hit that subscribe button. Let's jump into it. So let's start with Spurs, because I think a lot of people are wondering what to do with Son this week, especially around captaincy, given that it's such a good fixture against Ipswich at home. Ange Postecoglou confirmed that Mikey Moore is out. Richarlison, we already knew was out. He's going to be missing about 3 to 4 weeks. And then Timo Werner is likely to miss out. Those three players are really the main competition for Son when it comes to the left wing. Now, obviously, other players could play there, like James Maddison, for example. But if Son was to get subbed off early, it's one of those three players that would be most likely to come on. And they're all missing. So that's a good thing. But I'm going to come on to the quote about Son specifically in a second. Ange Postecoglou also said that Romero has a chance. They're going to see him in training today and tomorrow and then make a decision. So right now I'm looking at that Spurs defence with no Romero, no Van der Ven. Doesn't look great. But if you're a Porro owner, or maybe even Udogie, there is a chance that Romero will play. But either way, I don't think many people are buying Spurs defenders this week, but if you've got them, you're going to play them anyway, right? It's Ipswich at home. On Son, Ange went into a bit more detail. He said, we brought him back, and in the first game, he had a relapse. So that's the West Ham game, I think it was. Let me just double check. Yeah, it was West Ham, wasn't it? He went off on 69 minutes, then missed the next game. Yeah, so had a relapse, and what we don't want to do is put him into that cycle again. It's very easy to do. We're managing his minutes and building him up. He's got a good 55 on the weekend, so that was against Aston Villa, and got 45 last night. So Son started the game in Europe against Galatasaray and came off at half-time. So did Brennan Johnson, but Brennan Johnson's played a lot of 90 minutes recently. He then went on to say, hopefully we can build that up, but ultimately it's about getting him back and keeping him back. So I think even with all those players out that usually play left wing, Son's probably not making it past 70, 75 minutes because Ange Postecoglou doesn't want to risk him being out for longer, like after the international break. And Ipswich at home is, on paper, a good fixture that Spurs can win without Son having to play 90 minutes. So I think he'll definitely start, but I wouldn't be surprised to see him subbed off by the 70th minute, potentially even earlier, especially if the game is already looking comfortable. Obviously, if the game is comfortable, you're hoping that Son's had some returns, but that's not a guarantee. So I think around Son, I don't think I would buy him. I think because it's Man City away in Game Week 12, there's so little upside after the Ipswich game. And even if you bring him in, are you really comfortable captaining him? Like 70, 75 minutes against Ipswich might be enough to get a mega score and be a really good captain. But if you've got the likes of Salah or Haaland or Solanke, they just seem a bit more reliable this week, I would say, for that captain's armband. So I don't think I would buy him. Maybe if you were definitely wildcarding in Game Week 12, you could go for him as a one-week punt and then wildcard him back out. But I think in terms of buying him to then transfer him out later on, I don't really see the point. If you've got him in your squad already, happy days. He's almost certainly going to start that Ipswich game. You're definitely keeping him. The only decision is whether you captain him. Personally, I think what Ange said would probably put me off. Like a 55 and a 45-minute appearance over the last two. Like it could just be 55, 60 again. There's no guarantee he gets to that 70, 75 minute mark. So I'd rather go for someone else. But if you're looking for a big differential, that is Son. His ownership is pretty low. I don't think he's been massively brought in this week. I'd be really surprised. Let me just double check. He has had 95,000 transfers in, like less than Saka, Garnacho, Fernandes, Johnson, Semenyo. So it's not like his ownership has skyrocketed. I would just leave it as he's a differential on his own. But obviously, if you want to go for the captain as a big differential, cool. Don't mind it at all. But do not be shocked if he comes off early again. So the update that a lot of people have been waiting for is, of course, Cole Palmer. Now, Maresca was asked a question about him, but I think this press conference was basically embargoed from last night after the European match that Chelsea had. So it's not necessarily fresh information from Friday. Up until this point, we know that he hasn't trained Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but Maresca said he's better, he's getting better. Hopefully we can have him for the session at least on Saturday, and then we can take a decision. So that makes it sound like he might not even train on Friday, but could train on Saturday. And obviously the game against Arsenal is on Sunday. It's such a big game. I'm sure if he's able to play, he will. And he's also in the England squad, which is definitely encouraging. I think there is still doubts there. I'm not as 100% confident about him starting as everyone else seems to be. But if I had to put my own money on it, I would say that he's going to be in that starting 11. I think Cole Palmer this week is basically a classic don't buy, don't sell. Right? You don't need him for Arsenal at home. It's not an amazing fixture anyway. If you don't have him, you've probably got like a Saka or a Son in that spot. You can look to move them on in game week 12. And if you already own him, he's got such good fixtures from game week 12 onwards that it's probably not worth using a transfer to take him out and then bring him back in. Again, Son could be a massive differential this week if he gets good minutes. There's doubts there. I just don't think it's worth bringing him in for Palmer and then take him out unless you're on wildcard in game week 12. And like Chelsea's fixtures are so good that you could captain Cole Palmer every week from 12. I mean, maybe even up to 21. I'm not saying he's the best captain every week, and Spurs away in 15 is not great, but every other week is not bad. Like Leicester away is competitive against Salah against Southampton. Villa at home is the week that Salah and Haaland against each other. Southampton away explains itself. Brentford at home, Everton away, Fulham away. It's so good. Just keep him, right? So don't buy, don't sell. Easy as that for me with Palmer. So just on Liverpool, Arne Slot was asked about the gap between Robertson and Tsimikas, and we know that Tsimikas has started the last 2 games, so one in the Champions League and one in the Premier League as well. Slot said, I think my lineups tell you what I think about this. I have 2 very good left backs. Now, I couldn't find the full quote, but I think he went on to say that position is just one where there is going to be changes and substitutions and stuff like that. So I think basically going forward, Tsimikas and Robertson are both non-options because whichever one doesn't start will likely come on for a cameo, and you can never be sure each week who's going to be first choice. Like, I know a lot of people think that Tsimikas is now first choice left back for Liverpool. Maybe that's true, but I don't think we have enough games to say that with 100% certainty, and it could flip again. So I think I would just ignore both of them. He also spoke about Diogo Jota and said he expects him to be back 1 or 2 weeks after the international break. So it's Villa at home in 11, Southampton away in 12 after the international break. It doesn't sound like Jota's going to be back for that. So if you did take a punt on Nunez, I would just keep hold of him. I know that Diaz played as the central attacker in the Champions League, and it does mean that at some point Nunez could miss out in the Premier League, but I doubt it. I think he'll start against Villa at home and start against Southampton away as long as he's fit and available. And then obviously you can just reassess from game week 13 when it's Man City at home and potentially Jota is coming back. So I know most of you won't be looking at Brighton players this week because they got Man City at home, but they do have a good fixture run from game weeks 12, 13 onwards and some good value players potentially to look at for FPL. So it's worth keeping an eye on them. Hertzler spoke about injuries and he said some of them for sure will return. So I think especially João Pedro, Matt O'Reilly, they have a big chance. Now, presumably that's a big chance to be in the squad, not to start. So I wouldn't be looking at bringing them in this week. But João Pedro in particular is a potentially nailed-on attacker that's listed as a forward in FPL for only 5.4 million. And as far as we know, is first-choice penalty taker. Welbeck did take a couple in pre-season, but on both of those occasions, João Pedro was off the pitch. So I would expect João Pedro to take them when he's back. And look, I don't think I can sit here and say that he's absolutely nailed, but he did start all 3 of the first 3 games he was fit for. And at that time, Welbeck was being subbed a bit earlier and João Pedro was moving on into the number 9 position when that happened. So the reason I bring this up is a lot of people are looking for cheap forwards right now. If you're not sure which one to buy, it might be worth just keeping the one you've got for this week and reassessing from 12, 13 onwards to possibly look at like a Welbeck or maybe a João Pedro. Personally, I think there's no chance João Pedro starts this week, so I wouldn't be massively confident in game week 12, but if he comes off the bench in 12, 13 Southampton at home, you might be looking at him as a cheap option. On Minter and Lewis Dunk, he said we have to see the next few days, and for Solly March it's too early. So Minter might be back soon. That's yet another player to add to that Brighton attack. And Lewis Dunk is someone that I've actually become quite interested in over the last kind of 24 hours, and I'll talk about it a little bit later for my team. But he's currently priced at 4.4 million and on his way to another price drop. I don't know if that will happen, but if he goes down to 4.3, like Brighton have from 13 onwards, Southampton at home, Fulham away, Leicester away, Palace at home, West Ham away, Brentford at home, like from 13 to 18, you could pretty much play Lewis Dunk every single week if he was fit. Like, I'm not saying he would get a clean sheet every week. Fulham away is difficult, for example, but it's a good fixture and he's only 4.4. Or you can just go and pick up Van Heck, who's currently fit for 4.5. And then he went on to say that Ayeri, probably pronounced that wrong, will train today, so I think he might be an option for the weekend. And then FPL Instinctive on Twitter said that Lewis Dunk and Minter weren't filmed in training, so they're not going to be available probably for Game Week 11. Neither were João Pedro, Kadioglu, and Evan Ferguson. So he said that just because they're not there doesn't necessarily mean it's representative of them not being available, but it would put a few doubts. Either way, you're not buying João Pedro this week, maybe next week onwards. Kadioglu, I would just ignore for now, because once Minter is back, that's another player that can play on the right, so you wouldn't necessarily have Kadioglu as an out-of-position option, and I don't know if he would be 100% nailed to play across, to play in either of the fullback positions or in midfield. So I would just go for Van Heck if you really want a Brighton defender, or wait for Lewis Dunk after the international break. He also said, I couldn't see Welbeck in training, but someone was calling for Danny. So Danny Welbeck is probably fine. Some people probably looking at him this week rather than going for a Wolves player. I don't hate it. It's not the worst time to play Man City. He started every single game. But once everyone is back fit, could you see like João Pedro number 9, Rutter in the 10, Minter on the right, Mitoma on the left, and just Danny Welbeck missing out completely? I think it's possible, but given how well he's played, I think he will continue to start until something else changes. Anyway, probably spent too long on Brighton. No one's buying them before Man City, but I am definitely interested after the break. So for anyone that still owns Calvert-Lewin, it has not been great in FPL. It's like 6 blanks in a row at the moment. Not only that, he seems to have lost the 90 minutes that he'd had previously. So against Southampton in Game Week 10, he came off in the 61st minute, and against Fulham in Game Week 9, it was 80 minutes. Before that, he'd played 90 minutes every single game between Game Week 4 and Game Week 8. So the minutes are starting to reduce a little bit. When Beto has come on, he's done well. So there are some concerns over his starting position. I think for most Calvert-Lewin owners, he's going at some point, but a lot of people might want to hold him one more week and then make the decision after the international break. Now, Sean Dyche spoke about Calvert-Lewin versus Beto quite a lot, so I'm going to go through it. Sean Dyche said his decisions are impacted partly by the opposition and praised Calvert-Lewin for his role. He says Beto is learning more in the Premier League, particularly from his increase in minutes. Dyche adds, Beto is quite receptive to efforts at Finch Farm to encourage his development. He says there is a lot going on at the moment, and Beto is being rewarded with more minutes. So it does look like he's going to eat into Calvert-Lewin's minutes overall, not necessarily from the start. They stayed on Beto. Sean Dyche says strikers are typically viewed by their goals, and they do that at Everton, but adds the additional data behind that is also taken into account. Calvert-Lewin fares well on that front. So basically, he's not just picking a striker for goals, but also their all-round game, which potentially at the moment, Calvert-Lewin is better at than Beto. He says the margins are getting tighter, though. He is coming on and affecting games. So I kind of took that as Calvert-Lewin's probably starting, and Sean Dyche is basically setting that up from his answer. But it's probably getting to a point where Beto might have to start at some stage. Now, the way the fixtures are, West Ham away, Brentford at home on paper are not that bad. If you're going to get 70 minutes in each game out of Calvert-Lewin, it's not completely terrible. I'm not trying to say that people should keep him, but if you've got other transfers to deal with, it wouldn't be the end of the world if you have to hold him for 11 and or 12. From 15 onwards, the fixtures get really bad, so you need an exit route soon. And potentially by that point, Beto is starting. But I think right now, at least for Game Week 11, you're probably safe. He went on to say, on helping strikers who are not scoring goals, Dyche says a big part is paying attention to what they are doing and trying to build on that. And then there's a little bit more. But basically, I think Calvert-Lewin's going to start. So if you want to get rid of him, Cunha, Strand Larsen, Raul Jimenez, I mean, even Chris Wood, who's playing so well at the moment, Newcastle at home, Ipswich at home in 2 of the next 3. There's tons of options you can go for. But if you've got something else you want to do, or you just want to roll the transfer into 12, he's probably going to start West Ham away. That is a terrible defence. Even Calvert-Lewin might, and I only say might, score in that game. So let's get into some of your questions. As we get closer to the festive fixture congestion, how much more value is there in players who will play 90 minutes every week, such as Bruno Fernandes? Now, I think in general for FPL, it's always good to buy players that are definitely going to start and preferably also have really good minutes. Like, it doesn't always work out that they will score the most points, but more often than not, that will be the better play. Like, it's fine to buy someone that starts every week but maybe only gets 70 to 80 minutes but has great attacking stats or something like that. But generally, buying a player that's not nailed, yeah, sometimes it can work out in the short term, but long term, it's not necessarily going to be the case. So I think at any point in a season, it's worth thinking about. Whether it should massively change your strategy now we're going into December, not necessarily. I would just use it as another information point. Like, when you're thinking about buying or selling a player, you're looking at the stats, the fixtures, whether they start, how likely it is that they keep starting. Is there other players in that position that are currently injured? When are they coming back? All this stuff gets taken into account. And I don't think just because we're coming into December means you should have a massive shift in your focus about how you pick players, right? Like Bruno Fernandes is an example. I've spoken about him quite a lot this week. Next 3 fixtures are good. After that, who knows how Amorim will have them playing. And also, it's Arsenal away in 14, City away in 16. It's not great, and he's taken up a midfield spot. So is there justification to buy him just because he's going to play 90 minutes in all these games? Not necessarily. If you've already got him, there might be more reason to hold him rather than use a transfer to get him out because the fixtures from 17 onwards are good. But in terms of buying him, I wouldn't put massive emphasis on that. And also, Amorim's got a lot of work to do. I watched the Man United game last night. They were pretty terrible for a large majority of that game. And I know Slot came into Liverpool and they've been great, but Slot didn't have to make a huge amount of changes. And I'm not saying he hasn't done a great job, because he has. And of course, he's made tweaks along the way, etc. But Amorim's, it's almost like an overhaul for Man United if he's going to change formation. So it's not only that you're buying a player for 3 weeks and then hoping for the best after that. There's also a leap of faith that the manager will get it correct. So I would definitely take it into account, the minutes and stuff like that. But I would always take that into account. I've mentioned that with Cunha, for example, at Wolves. Look, 6.7 million, is that a little bit expensive? Possibly, when you can get Strand Larsen for 5.6. But one thing you get from him is guaranteed starts and guaranteed minutes with great fixtures over a congested fixture period. So I always prefer players like that. I definitely like them over December as well, but it wouldn't necessarily make me not buy a player if there's slight doubts there. I've been racking my brains for a good example to show where I would buy a player even though there's slight doubts there, and I can't really think of a good one. Like Raul Jimenez I just bought, for example, I guess, and there is a chance that Muniz might play a game during like midweek fixtures, possibly to give Raul Jimenez a rest. Would that massively put me off buying him? I don't think so because of the price. But if there was someone else around that price that was guaranteed to play, I might go for them instead. It's similar with Bruno Fernandes. It's hard to give a good example because there's not many players around his price. But I guess on wildcard 6, right, I went for Fernandes instead of Diaz because Diaz wasn't nailed on and there was a rotation threat from Gakpo. So if it was a similar decision now, I would definitely pick Bruno instead. But then I would have always done that outside of it being December. So I guess just take it into account. The other thing to think about is players are starting to build up yellow cards and we're still quite a long way away from the 19 matches. So you're going to get suspensions in your team at some point. Because there's midweek games, players are playing more minutes, they're maybe more susceptible to picking up injuries. So suspensions and injuries might become more of a problem. So I guess I'll leave it at this. If I had 2 players that were quite similar and one was guaranteed to play 90 minutes every week, the other one wasn't, then I'd always pick the 90-minute man. But I'd probably do that if this was September as well. So lots of us have a benching dilemma this week. When deciding who to play, should we play the safe pick such as Chris Wood or target the bigger differential like Semenyo? Now, in this specific scenario, I think I would just play Chris Wood regardless of ownership and stuff like that because I just think he is the better option. Like, I really rate Semenyo. He's one of the best cheap midfielders to own right now. Brentford defence is not that strong. I expect Bournemouth to score, but I also think that Forest will score against Newcastle. They're at home, which counts for something, and Chris Wood is on penalties. So for me, I would have Chris Wood ahead of Semenyo, and therefore I would just play him. I wouldn't take ownership or anything like that into account. If you think the decision's a lot closer than that, or you've got another decision to be made between 2 other players, and you genuinely think it's a coin flip in terms of who's going to score the most, then really it comes down to what type of FPL manager you are. I would like to think in those situations I would pick the differential. I would chase the upside rather than go for the more shield pick. But also that might depend what rank you are. If you're already in the top 10k, top 100k, something like that, and there's a player you're thinking about benching, but they've got massive ownership, I personally don't think there's anything wrong with just playing them so you don't get massively punished. But a lot of people will say, even in that position, go for the differential pick. Because if it works out and you're on the right side of that coin flip, you then move up the ranks even more. As an example, right, for my team, as you know, if you've been following, I sold Heung-min Son last week. Maybe that doesn't look like such a bad decision now because of his minutes being managed. But either way, I wish I hadn't done it. If I was sat here with Son and Salah instead of Palmer and Salah, then there'd be a decision to be made about captaincy. If Son didn't have any fitness concerns right now, had played 80 to 90 minutes in each of the last 3-4 matches, then I would like to think that Son against Ipswich at home and Salah against Villa at home is a close call, and I would go for Son as the differential because not many people own him. There's massive upside in that. But if I was in a position where I own Son and Salah right now with the information we have that Son is a bit of a risk, he could have his minutes managed, I would probably go Salah because I don't think the call is close enough to go for Son because he could come off in like the 60th, 65th minute. So it's really going to depend on what the decision is and how genuinely close it is. Like Rodgers, for example, Liverpool, well, I'm just not going to play him. It doesn't matter what ownership he has. All of my other players have better fixtures. Like Calvert-Lewin versus Rodgers, I bet there's some people that have to decide between that this week, even though Calvert-Lewin has blanked for as many games. Is it 6? 1, 2. Yeah, it is 6. I would still play Calvert-Lewin over Rodgers because I think West Ham away is a better fixture. If Everton get a penalty and Calvert-Lewin's on the pitch, he will take it. Liverpool defence is good. I would go for Calvert-Lewin even though Rodgers is highly owned and probably more regarded right now. I would take that Calvert-Lewin differential instead. So I think you have to basically decide, is that decision really that close? If it's not, just pick the player you think is going to score the most points. If it's a coin flip, I like to think in most cases I would go differential, but sometimes, and I've done this before, you just go for the safe pick because you don't want to be punished. So if you had the opportunity to sell Gabriel and Trent to get a midfield of Son, Saka, Salah and Palmer, would you take it? I don't think I would use free transfers to do it, no. Like, even to the point that if you said to me, you've used your first wildcard, but here's another one, you've got to use it in game week 11, I still don't think I would take out both Gabriel and Trent, or even one of them, to get that midfield. And part of the reason is, I'm going to talk through this a little bit later when I get to my team, but any time I make a plan which involves selling Trent, I hate having to pick 2 other defenders to play alongside Gabriel every week. And I know right now the narrative is that premium defenders are not really pulling their weight, they're not worth the money, why not just go cheap? And that might continue to work, but I'm not sure that will necessarily be the best strategy forever. And I'm not going to go into full details about this, I've spoken about it a lot, but from game week 12 onwards, Arsenal's fixtures, really good. Definitely want to have at least one of their defenders. And with Trent, I am happy to acknowledge that right now his price does seem a bit steep, but it would only take 1 or 2 bigger scores and suddenly people will change their tune on Trent. And I think apart from the Man City game and maybe Newcastle away in 14, the fixtures actually aren't that bad for quite a while. Like Spurs away in 17, not great. But outside of that, from 11 to 25, the fixtures are pretty good. I've still got faith that Trent is capable of more attacking returns than he's shown so far. The Liverpool defence is looking great. And I now see him as a bigger differential, as I've said before. So I don't think dropping one or both of them, in this case, to get that midfield is worth it. And partly because Son, Saka, Salah and Palmer are all great, right? But part of the reason you pay that money is for captaincy. So I can only captain one of those 4 every week. I think my squad would be stronger overall by not having all 4 of them and having premium defenders instead, which I think at some point will pay off more so than having a bunch of 4.5s. Essentially, not having these 4 and having the 2 defenders instead is similar reasons why people have sold Haaland recently. It's not that Haaland is a terrible pick. He will get plenty of goals over the next few weeks, but your squad looks better overall, and I would prefer my squad without all 4 of these attackers, basically. So I don't think I would do it. Even if you offer me a wild card this week, I would definitely keep Gabriel, and I'm confident-ish that I would keep Trent as well. I'd at least go for like a Van Dijk or a Konate, which I appreciate are not the same price. But yeah, I mean, that midfield would look great on paper. But like in Burmo's I bought him at 7.1. At least for the next few weeks, he can probably not match these guys, but he probably won't be that far off. So are there any reasons to avoid double ups in general, or should I focus only on individual players? Now, generally, I think we should be focused on individual players. So, for example, if you've got Cunha already and you're looking for another cheap forward and you think that Strand Larsen is better than Chris Wood, Calvert-Lewin, João Pedro, whoever it might be, then really you're saying that Strand Larsen is going to get you the most points, and therefore having Cunha shouldn't really be a factor in your decision unless you think you're going to want two other Wolves players, for example, right? So for Arsenal, another example, if I go for Saka and Havertz, they're both really good picks, but that locks me off from double Arsenal defence. And generally, I think the Arsenal defenders are a level above other defenders, more so than Saka and Havertz are above other attackers. So you've got to take into account how many other players you might want from that team. But in general, I think you should focus on individual players. Why do people sometimes not do that? One is just a psychological thing. Like if you've got two attackers from Wolves and they decide to, play really bad over the next few games, then that's two players that are probably not getting you a huge amount of returns. And that can be frustrating. So some people just like to have a bit more variety in their teams. And I think that's fair, right? You've got to be happy with how your team is. And generally, I think the happier you are with your team, the better decisions you will make. The other reason is that when the bad fixtures come, they obviously come at the same time for both of those players that you have. I think in the case of Wolves, the fixtures are so good for so long, it's probably not a massive issue. But once you get past Leicester away in 17, they've got Man United at home, Spurs away, and Forest away. Now, it's not a completely terrible fixture run, but overall, from 18, the fixtures do get tougher. And after Forest at home, it's Newcastle away, Chelsea away, Arsenal at home, Villa at home, Liverpool away. It ain't great. So all of a sudden, you've got two players to deal with at once. But the reality is, if you've got someone different just to avoid a double up, their fixtures are not going to be great forever either. So I think you should be looking at players, and I see that all the time. Like, I've got this midfielder from this team, so should I avoid the forward? Most of the time, the answer is no. If you think that's the best pick, then go for them. If you think it's close between two players and one is a double up and one isn't, maybe in that case you go for the non-double up. But usually I think it's fine. But I don't know what the person that asked this question is referring to, which double up. But I know I'm going to get questions about Cunha and Strand Larsen. And deep down, I know it's fine to own both of them. But there is something about it that just doesn't feel right. Having two forwards from the same team. But then you've got two forwards against Southampton at home. You've got two forwards that are playing Ipswich and Leicester before the end of game week 17. I think it's fine, but this happens a lot in FPL. There's psychological reasons why people don't do it. I'm sure there's something else I'm missing, but I think as long as you're not going to block yourself from other players, and as long as you've got a plan later on to deal with it, I don't think there's really too much concern. Obviously, if Wolves have a terrible game against Southampton, it's annoying, but you could pick someone different to the second Wolves forward, and they could also have a bad game. So, yeah, I think the majority of the times you should be focused on individual players. So is Phil Foden worth keeping? I feel like this question comes up every single week, and my answer is pretty much always the same. If you want to keep Foden, nothing wrong with that whatsoever. If you've got other players to deal with and you haven't got the spare transfers to get rid of Foden, then it's also fine to keep him. I think for game week 11 specifically, there's a very good chance that he will start. Kevin De Bruyne is only just back. It's not a bad fixture for an attacker, and he's probably been a little bit unlucky to have the lack of returns that he's had over the last 3-4 game weeks. So he's still a pretty good pick. There's every chance he'll get you a return or two, maybe even more against Brighton if it's a really good day. So nothing wrong with owning him. Long term, personally, I've got zero interest in Foden. I don't think 9.3 million is necessarily great value. And he also just takes up a midfield spot. Even me with Bruno Fernandes, I've had the whole season that people think I just can't let go of. If I want Saka, he's the player that has to go. So if I put Saka in here, just quickly, and again, this is a midfield that a lot of people are building towards. Saka, Salah, Palmer, and Burmo, Rodgers. There's no place for Foden. Would I rather have Foden than Rodgers or maybe in Burmo? Yeah, but he's a lot more money. So I think it's fine to keep, but personally, if I had him right now, I would be planning already about when I'm going to sell him. When do I have the transfer to get rid of him? Who am I bringing in? That's probably I wouldn't even say it's got to happen, but I think it would have to happen for me if I owned him. And also, if De Bruyne does build up his fitness, it's just another player to take Foden's place. Remembering that Foden hasn't played wide that often this season. He can obviously do it, but it could also be Doku on the left, Savinho on the right, Bernardo and De Bruyne when when De Bruyne is fully fit and available, and Foden might just be on the bench. So you've not got a 100% guarantee of minutes moving forward. He's 9.3 million. Could you keep him this week? Absolutely. He should start. Long term, no interest, like I've said before. So just quickly on my team, at the moment I'm still playing Raya in the 11 and I've got Fabianski against Everton at home on the bench. I did say in yesterday's team selection video that if Palmer was fit, I might take Raya out of the 11 because obviously if Palmer does well, I'm losing the Arsenal clean sheet. I mean, Raya could save a penalty or get a bunch of saves, but realistically, if Palmer does well, Raya's probably not picking up a huge amount of points. Now, I still think it's more likely that Palmer plays than he doesn't, but it's not a guarantee. There are still doubts there. So I've got Raya in the 11. The other thing that's playing on my mind, and this is kind of what I spoke about earlier, the psychological reasons that people make decisions in FPL. I've had double Arsenal defence since game week 6. It's gone terrible. There's part of me that thinks if this is the week I take Raya out and he gets a clean sheet, that's going to be an absolute killer. And that shouldn't be how I make the decision. It should be Raya or Fabianski who's going to score more points. But because it's quite close, I think I've got to play Arsenal because if they do get a clean sheet, not only will I miss that, it also means Palmer's blank. So it's like a double blow. So at the moment I'm playing Raya. I also don't think it's a guarantee that West Ham get a clean sheet. Everton at home on paper, great fixture. That defence is pretty terrible. So I might switch that by deadline tomorrow, but I need to have a bit more of a think. Right now I'm playing Raya. Everything else is staying as it was. We just need to discuss my transfer a bit more because that has evolved from yesterday. So Trent, Gabriel, Pinnock all playing. I'm not going to take a hit just to bench Pinnock. I don't expect a clean sheet there. Hopefully he can get me a goal. If he does get a clean sheet, absolute bonus. Palmer I'm going to keep. Easy, don't buy, don't sell, I think, at the moment. Fernandes and Burmo, Salah is my captain. I think Fernandes and Solanke are okay captain options as well, but not as good as Salah, so I'm just going to keep the armband on him. And then it's Raul Jimenez, Solanke, and Calvert-Lewin up front. My bench is Fabianski, Rodgers, Lewis, and Greaves. Now, yesterday, I said it's quite likely that I'm going to sell Calvert-Lewin to Cunha. Today, I think it's more likely that I roll or I buy Strand Larsen instead. Now, the reason to roll would basically be to have 2 free transfers after the international break and also reassess Brighton forwards. Because I think Wolves ones look really good this week, but from 12:30 onwards, Brighton could be decent as well. And look, I don't expect anything from Calvert-Lewin, but if he does start, which I think he will, then he could get something. And he's not necessarily any worse than any other forwards for 1 week only. So I could roll, but I think I'm going to buy Strand Larsen. Because someone pointed out to me yesterday that if I want to do Fernandes to Saka, which is not a move that I'm guaranteed to make in future weeks, but it's one that I'm very likely to want to make, because of the money in the bank, I'm not that far off just doing Lewis down to a defender to fund it. So yesterday I was saying that if I got Cunha to do Fernandes to Saka, I would have to sell Trent. But if I go for a cheaper forward, then I can just afford to do Fernandes to Saka just by selling Rico Lewis, who I think long-term is just not a great option anyway. So at the moment, if I was to keep Calvert-Lewin, Bruno to Saka would require a 4.3 million defender for Rico Lewis. Now, Lewis Hall is 4.3 right now. That might not stick forever, but there are options around that price. But if I do Calvert-Lewin to Strand Larsen, who's got Southampton at home this week, then suddenly I've got 4.6 million to spend. Now, Saka could go up in price that week, between now and by the time I make the transfer. But even if he goes up 0.1, I'd still have 4.5 to spend. There's a lot of options around 4.5 million. Also, Bruno Fernandes, I bought him at 8.3. He went down to 8.2. And he's getting close to a price rise. So once he goes back up to 8.3, that's another 0.1 million to spend. So I'm probably going to have 4.5 or 4.6 million to spend on this defender without having to get rid of anyone else. So I still have Raya, Trent, Gabriel, Salah, Palmer. I'd be bringing Saka in and having Burmo. Still got Solanke up front. I haven't had to downgrade him to a cheaper forward. my biggest sacrifices are basically having Strand Larsen and Raul Jimenez. Now, I stand by what I've said, that I think between now and 17 for Wolves' good fixtures, Cunha is more likely to score points than Strand Larsen. Like, I think Cunha will score the most points because he's absolutely nailed on. He does take some set pieces, and he'd be ahead of Strand Larsen in the pecking order for penalties. But Strand Larsen's the out-and-out number 9. It does feel weird paying 6.7 million for Cunha when he's not basically the number 9. And also, if Sarabia keeps getting minutes, he was back last week, he may well be ahead of Cunha in the pecking order for penalties. So potentially, I'd be paying 1.1 million more, not for the number 9 and not for the penalty taker. Now Cunha's great for bonus, right? And he can go and get you assists as well. And I still think he will score the most points. Will he score 1.1 million worth of points more than Strand Larsen? I don't know. I mean, I might be sat here in a few weeks thinking, oh, Strand Larsen's just got benched. That's a bit of a nightmare. And now I'm kind of stuck with him because the only forward I can go to at that price is João Pedro. And if he's not an option, then I'm having to downgrade elsewhere. But I feel like the upside is quite big. If Strand Larsen does keep playing, the fixtures are good, and it allows me to get the midfield I want without having to sacrifice any other player. And I know people will be sat there thinking, just sell Trent, he's not worth the money. The more people keep saying that to me, the more I want to keep him. I think he's capable of doing more than people are giving him credit for. I think that looks quite nice. So the plan would be Calvert-Lewin to Strand Larsen this week, just to get that Southampton fixture. So I'd make that transfer in 11. In 12, I'd only have one free transfer, so I'd probably just roll my team. There's nothing really wrong with it. Strand Larsen, Fulham away. Raul Jimenez, Wolves at home. I could play Solanke at all Rodgers. The midfield all looks good. Like, my midfield has Southampton away, Leicester away, Everton away, Ipswich away as the fixtures. So all three of the newly promoted clubs covered. At what point do I stop saying newly promoted, by the way? Because they've been promoted for a while now. Anyway, Trent, Southampton away, and then double Arsenal defence, Forest at home. Looks pretty good. Then I go into game week 13 and I've got 2 free transfers, as long as nothing else has happened. And that week, it's Fernandes out if I want to, before Everton at home, and I buy Saka instead. And then, like I said, I've got 4.6 million to spend once I take Rico Lewis out. Now, Rico Lewis might drop in price at some point, and that would reduce his value to me by 0.1. But someone like Lewis Dunk is only 4.4 right now, and potentially on his way to another drop soon. And he'd have Southampton at home in game week 13. So all of a sudden, I'm playing Lewis Dunk I'm playing Lewis Dunk in game week 13, probably ahead of Trent. Southampton at home, Pinnock's got Leicester at home, Gabriel's got West Ham away. But from 14 onwards, it's basically Gabriel and Trent every single week, and then one of Pinnock or Dunk. And Dunk can basically be played every week. And the only real sacrifice is Strand Larsen instead of Cunha. I think that looks pretty good. That I could be going into game weeks 13, 14 with Raya, Gabriel, Trent, Saka and Burmo, Palmer, Salah, Solanke, Raul Jimenez, Strand Larsen. In theory, it sounds pretty good to me. The only slight issue is, if I think Cunha is going to score more points, and then I go for Strand Larsen, and then I end up selling Trent to fund Saka anyway, then I've got a player that's not quite so good. But basically, my thinking is I should just go for the cheaper player to leave that option open. It's much better to sell Rico Lewis than it is to sell Trent. No matter what you think of Trent right now, we know he's got the capabilities of doing much better than he has. It's just that you get stuck. Raul Jimenez and Strand Larsen, there's nowhere to go if you haven't got money in the bank, apart from João Pedro, and who knows if he'll be absolutely nailed. So I think I'm going to buy Strand Larsen. I mean, I said yesterday I was going to buy Cunha, and I've already changed my mind, like maybe 24 hours later or just over. The idea of being able to get Saka without having to sacrifice Trent, I think that's big. I think there's a lot of options 4.5 or below in defence. I just don't want to play 2 of them every week. Like, if I just go back to game week, let's just go back to game week 13, the week that I buy Saka. I'll just keep Dunk in there, but I'll do Trent out for let me just put Lewis back in, basically. So let's say I've sold Trent for Dunk instead of selling Lewis to fund the Saka move, and just pretend I've got Cunha there. Playing Gabriel every week's not a problem, and in game week 13 specifically, Pinnock and Dunk looks quite good. But then in game week 14, I'm hoping that Rico Lewis plays against Forest at home. I might not have any guarantees that happens. In game week 15, it's Dunk against Leicester away and then Pinnock against Newcastle at home or Lewis against Palace away. Potentially, that could be great if those two players keep playing. And I will have future transfers to make other moves for cheap defenders. But I don't want to spend the next few weeks just making moves for cheap defenders. I want to just get Dunk and have Trent and Gabriel. And then basically nothing to worry about until injuries crop up or suspensions or the fixtures turn. So I'm very keen on keeping Trent. I think he's a massive differential. And I think people will want him later on. And by keeping him, I'm basically saving myself a transfer and hoping to get some points while he becomes a differential. So I've gone on the wrong screen there. Yeah, I'm probably going to buy Strand Larsen for Calvert-Lewin. Go into 12 with one free transfer. Hopefully have nothing to do. And then pick up Saka in 13 by selling Rico Lewis, possibly for Lewis Dunk, possibly for Van Heck. And if they're not options, there's Lewis Hall, there's Colwill, depending on how much money I've got to spend. The plan seems pretty good. The plans don't always work out well. I'm obviously doing pretty bad this season, but maybe Strand Larsen is the key to doing well. I'll leave it there. Let me know what you think about that in the comments below. If you've enjoyed it, make sure to give it a like and hit that subscribe button. Rate 5 stars if you listen on podcasts. Check out Fantasy Football Hub using the link in the description below. And I will catch you tomorrow for the deadline stream.